Hey everyone, it's Brandon Lee, host of the podcast Escaping Rock Bottom, where we talk everything about addiction, recovery, and also trauma. I have wanted to sit down with Dr. Sue Sisley for years. I mean, years I've wanted to sit down with Dr. Sisley just because she is so forward-thinking, and she has been from the very beginning, and what she's trying to accomplish by helping people heal from trauma. And you know what I love most about Dr. Sisley is that she pushes the envelope. When many other people out there in the science world say, wait, what are you doing? This isn't right. No, she's a true belief system in what she's doing. And I'm just so grateful to have you on the podcast.
Oh, I'm thrilled to be here. And I so appreciate you're pushing boundaries, especially in the addiction realm. It's so valuable, the messaging you're putting out to the public.
Thank you. And likewise. And I remember when I first reached out to you, when I first, really heard about you when I moved to Arizona back in 2013, you were so forward thinking about I laugh about it now because how socially acceptable marijuana has become and the impacts of it. But you are one of the first leading researchers in the entire country to figure out how can marijuana help those with PTSD. Back then, when did that begin for you? Was that like 2008-ish, 2007?
It was when, 20 years ago, me and my mom started our medical practice together. And we had a large cohort of military veterans that we were treating. And they were the ones who really first taught me about how cannabis and psychedelics, plant medicine in general, was benefiting them in all kinds of ways. And I was super skeptical. Me and my mom are both very conservative trained physicians who don't believe, at that point, we didn't believe anything was a medicine unless it was approved by FDA.
Right.
And then when I started, I felt that even though I was still dubious, I felt we had a duty to these veterans to study it in a rigorous way. And so that's what led me down this path of learning about all the myriad of government barriers to doing this research. I mean, if you dare say you want to study anything in Schedule 1, you're going to have to be prepared for a fight. You're going to have a big struggle with the government at all levels to do this. These plants have been unfairly criminalized since 1970 when Nixon signed the Controlled Substance Act. And it makes it very difficult for scientists to attempt to even to begin to study this in a rigorous way.
And I will just say this, because you are such a hero of mine because of the pushback that you received, because you were so far advanced at the time to what was socially acceptable, and not only just socially acceptable, but also government acceptable.
Yes.
And you received a lot of pushback, but you continue to push on because you truly believed in it. What were your initial results in the studies that you were doing with marijuana and a lot of veterans with PTSD? What were those findings, and what were the result of a lot of that?
Yeah, well, there was a big difference between the studies we were doing were what they call randomized control trials. So it's like the gold standard for evaluating something as a medicine, but the RCTs they required that we buy weed from the government, which was very frustrating because the cannabis from University of Mississippi, which was the only federally legal supplier for 50 years, that cannabis was so low quality. I mean, most people didn't even recognize it as cannabis. It was so anemic and therefore didn't perform well in clinical trials. So that's part of what motivated us to keep going, was that we saw that these studies were sort of being unfairly almost sabotaged by this low quality study drug. And we wanted to fight to persuade the government to allow us to use real world cannabis in these trials. And so eventually we were successful, but it took many years of bringing thousands of patients to Congress, people power, trying to lobby. Finally we ended up litigating in federal court, and that was the ultimate success because we found sympathetic judges there who understood that these attempts by the government to monopolize the study drug, to say you can only have one federally legal supplier, it was like an attack on scientific freedom. It ultimately, studies on plant medicine probably will never be successful if the only thing we're allowed to do is use like an isolated molecule to, the plant. There's wisdom in the whole plant that can't be replicated when you just isolate one cannabinoid or one terpene. So that's what we were fighting for, to be able to grow our own cannabis and be able to use whole cannabis in trials.
Well, that leads me to just this very simple question, which may have a very complex answer. Does cannabis help people with PTS?
That we haven't been able to confirm that in a randomized control trial. So in medicine, unless it's confirmed in these, double-blind studies, then it wouldn't technically be considered a successful treatment. But our observational studies where people were allowed to use real-world cannabis, those have been really compelling. And so that keeps us motivated to keep pursuing this, because we feel like there is enough signals in these observational trials where people, and it may come to a point where we just, if this next study we do where we're using real world cannabis in a randomized controlled trial, if that does not prove to be a positive outcome, we may just have to admit that botanical medicines are very difficult to study in controlled trials, and we can never replicate the transformative experiences people are having in the real world. But we have centuries of stories from, shamans, medicine men that verify that these plants are medically active, that they do exert good positive clinical effects, but it may not be reproducible in a study. Right. And that's something that's what's so difficult working with the government, because there's so many restrictions on as long as these medicines are criminalized by our government, it's always going to be really difficult to create real world studies. So
it's fascinating stuff. I practice shamanism. Yes. I have a shaman from Alaska. And as a matter of fact, later today, I do it weekly. And at 5 p.m. today, I have my shaman session.
That's awesome.
Yeah, because it's the one thing that has healed me.
Yes.
And now, mind you, he does ceremonies as well. Okay. He'll use ayahuasca sometimes, and, they'll do shrooms in order to really, Sue, to get people past the frontal lobe,
yes.
right? To get people past the frontal lobe, to get them to the lower part of the brain where the trauma memories are stored. Yep. Important in shamanism is the belief that the energy lives in the lower part of our spines, and that we have to process that energy. So really, the psychedelics that he uses really is almost just as a way to get people past the frontal lobe in order for them to heal people in those trauma, in the traumatic memories.
That's so smart. Yeah. Have you experimented with a lot of different psychedelics?
So here's the thing that I have done. I actually do it through deep breath work. So I'm able through deep breath work to get past the frontal lobe. However, that leads me to this next conversation with you. And this is what I'm so fascinated about, because I'm absolutely open and willing to doing this, is talking about psychedelics. And we are talking about things like LSD and things like shrooms, and microdosing. Can you first talk to me about what microdosing is? Because I think the stigma that we're up against, folks like you and I who are so I'm absolutely in favor of using psychedelics to help people heal trauma. Mm-hmm. So how do we get past the stigma? And I think it's explaining what exactly is, we're not just putting mushrooms on a piece of pizza to have a trip, to go out there and have this crazy trip on the beach, right? Mm-hmm. We're talking about microdosing as well. What is microdosing?
Yeah, I think it's just a way of accessing the material, ingesting mushrooms without having a full hallucinogenic experience. It's like we call, I forget the term now, just skipped out of my head, but it's just below that, where you're still able to enjoy some of the positive benefits. Like people do report small doses of psilocybin giving them elevated mood, maybe increased focus, things like that. All things that we want to study further, because we're so interested in the potential to utilize a microdose even on a daily basis and see how people do with that. It all still is being studied more vigorously now. We finally got our DEA license to grow our own psilocybin mushrooms for research. So that was a big, a big push for us, because the studies that we were seeing were all looking at isolated psilocybin, and we believe that whole mushrooms may offer more benefit. When you allow the mushroom to reach its full expression in a whole fruiting body, you get the benefit of all these alkaloids and tryptamines that seem to be working together synergistically, the same way we see with cannabis. We talk about whole plant cannabis having that entourage effect where all these molecules working in concert with each other. So I think that's why it was so important, though, to get our own federal license. So now we can grow federally legal whole mushrooms and use them in studies. We can start to prepare microdoses, expose patients to escalating doses, starting with the tiniest amount, going up to the highest that they can tolerate, to see what is that range that is a microdose. It's really hard to define a microdose. You can read on blogs what people think is a microdose for them, but
right. It's and each drug hits somebody so differently. Yes. I mean, that's just the way the body makeup is, yes. The science makeup is. Yeah. But let me ask you this: when trauma happens, what does it actually do to the wiring of the brain? And then, therefore, how can the psychedelics help with that rewiring, or help with the wiring of the brain to help heal that trauma? I know that's like a really loaded and complex question, because when trauma happens, it impacts our brain.
We think, that when traumatic memories settle into those structures in the brain, especially the amygdala is a big focus of that, and the longer it's entrenched in those structures, we think it's harder to sort of unveil that trauma and bring it to the forefront. So that's why there's a lot of interest now in trying to treat trauma as early as possible. Also, but the point is that psychedelics seem to enable people, by promoting connectedness to nature and empathy and things like that. People seem to be able to sort of confront the trauma, to allow it to come to the surface. We have so many defense mechanisms in our brain that push this down, that make sure it stays suppressed so we can be functional from day to day. But ultimately, then the trauma is still stagnating there, still affecting people's day to day. So that's why psychedelics offer the most hope for sort of allowing that to surface in a less scary way. It's not so intimidating, and they can then process trauma through integration work. So that's why it's so important when people hear about these like MDMA assisted therapy and other studies being done with psilocybin. We worry that people are going to get the idea that they can just go take some MDMA and
heal themselves. Yeah. No, it doesn't work that way. But I love the language you're speaking, because I'm 100% in belief of that. In that, when trauma happens, we go into survival mode, and that's why we bury it so far back in the lower part of our brains, because naturally our bodies never want to remember it. Yeah. But we can bury it as far as we want to go, to the point that some people won't even want to remember the trauma. That's how far they'll bury it. Mm-hmm. But they have no idea it is still impacting their life today, and it's impacting every decision that they make. And really, I can do it through deep breath work, get past the frontal lobe to the lower part of my brain. Yeah. But if you're with somebody, a trained therapist, a shaman who knows what the heck they're doing, right, to do a lot of that inner child work to heal people from the trauma, being able to microdose with them and guiding them, essentially making the patient more vulnerable, into being open to talking in a healing way about what they went through.
That's the key, and that's what's so impressive about your ability to reach that state just with breath work.
Just breath work in about 8 minutes.
That's incredible. I mean, because most of us don't have that kind of skill. So most of our patients are dependent on using a psychedelic to crack that and be able to, expedite their therapy process.
Because I tell people all the time, there's a huge difference between talk therapy and this kind of therapy that we're talking about. Talk therapy is all frontal lobe. This is all rationalization.
Yes.
This not tap into the lower part of my brain. You may talk about what happened, but you're not connecting to that real trauma. And that energy is still living in your body. Trust me, I have done years and years of talk therapy, but it's the shamanism that has allowed me to go back and reprocess a lot of the childhood trauma, even adult trauma, right? Surviving 9/11 and seeing the things that I experienced on that day, right? As an adult at age 21. But it has allowed me to go back and reprocess that trauma as an adult. The only way we can reprocess trauma in that way is to get past the frontal lobe. Yes. And I am of the rarity, and I know that. My shaman will tell me, he goes, not many people can do breath work in 8 to 10 minutes and be able to drop in the way that you do, which is why we need to be open to microdosing, whether it's LSD or whether it's shrooms or whether it's these other medicines, microdosing them to be able to help a patient crack the code of the frontal lobe in order to get back to the lower part.
That's it. And it's just so unfair the way these psychedelics have been villainized
it's by the government too.
And you think about when we're talking about addictions, it's hard to ignore that the 12-step community has really seems to have made it their life's work to ensure that these drugs continue to be criminalized, and they are promoting the stigma around these drugs by sort of threatening people in the 12-step arena that if they use these drugs as a bridge, it's like sort of an exit ramp off these more, severe drugs of abuse, that somehow they're violating their code of conduct. And it's really unfortunate. I wish that they would rethink some of these antiquated ideas. I mean, their own founder, Bill Wilson, has well documented his use of LSD and how he attributes LSD to being able to maintain his abstinence from alcohol for many decades. And it wasn't just 12-step alone that was doing, and that's important for people to be aware of. The 12-step community seems, very adamant that their current antiquated model is the only one that should move forward. And I would hope there's a day where they can look at the data. That's why we're working so hard to do these studies. I mean, the veteran community always tells me, they're like, Sue, we don't need your studies. Like, we know this works for us. So, hey, thanks for trying, but, we're going to keep doing what we've been doing. And they have all their underground networks where they're sharing medicine with each other. So I get that. They acknowledge that, like, the studies may be helpful for advancing public policy, like we may see. But even with that, we do studies, and you can see how long it takes. I mean, it took us 7 years to get our first cannabis study completed. It's crazy.
Meanwhile, all these other people are still suffering out there, and they're hurting. And listen, I will always give thanks, because I will always give thanks to AA at the very beginning of my recovery. Because Sue, I went to 5 meetings a week for 12 years. That is a lot. All right, so I have a lot of experience. But the one thing that I did start to push back on, and I just said, but they never want to advance, right? They never want to update the book, right? They never want to update. And I'm a huge believer in science. I just am a huge believer in science. And they do say one day there may be a magic pill that, da-da-da. And I'm like, well, maybe that pill does exist. Maybe it does. And maybe it's science, and maybe it is microdosing. And we have to be open to that. And, one thing, I had a sponsor one time I said, you don't have a problem with me taking a Xanax. It's prescribed by my doctor. But just because my doctor prescribes me a Xanax, you're okay with that. But here, I'm being ostracized for wanting to microdose shrooms or to help me to heal from the trauma, because I am of the belief that trauma is the gateway.
Yes.
Trauma is the gateway to addiction, and unhealed trauma is the reason why we numb. So I'm of the belief, well, if that's what I believe, then if we go back and we heal from the trauma, who's to say that person, once they're healed, can't go out and have a drink again in their life? Because if you're not trying to numb the trauma, but I have my belief system, and my goodness, I get a lot of backlash with that as well. But I'm just a huge believer in science, and that we have to believe in science, and we have to be forefront in thinking that it's all about trauma and healing people from that trauma.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, it's so important that 12-step does evolve over time, that they are able to look at the data. I mean, we're getting
MAT exists, medical assisted treatment.
It is astonishing, the data that my study sponsor, MAPS, the nonprofit that's, promoted all this MDMA research for 30 years. They have been, documenting like 2/3 of the patients in these MDMA assisted therapy studies, 2/3 have no detectable PTSD at the end of these, about 3 months of therapy with the MDMA assistance. So I'm just saying, like, this is an opportunity for us to cure illness, not just take Prozac for 20 years and never be healthy. The idea that we can enable people to close that chapter of their life and actually go on to,
be functioning.
Yes, that's the key. Is like, that's why I think 12-step is being so short-sighted by dismissing. If they would look at the data that's already been published, it's not a guesswork anymore. We're not speculating. We have data from FDA phase 3 clinical trials that have been so compelling, they persuaded FDA to give us breakthrough therapy designation and fast track us through. So the fact that 12-step community is not looking at this data with a objective attitude, they're continuing to wallow in the stigma around this and promote stigma, which this judgmental attitude towards psychedelics is harming their own community. Because
it's interesting though, because I'm friends obviously with the work that I do at Art of Our Soul, and I partner with about 15 treatment centers, and you talk to the treatment center owners, right? Even the owners believe in MAT. Yeah. They believe in medical assisted treatment because they see it and they do it, and they'll still go to meetings, right? They still be AA, but they'll tell me, they're like, but Brandon, at the same time, this is where I also break with AA, and that we do believe in science, and we do offer MAT treatment. We do MAT at our treatment centers.
Oh, good.
So the treatment centers, most treatment centers are in favor of medical assisted treatment, understanding that. What I want the general public to understand from my point of view is that I wish I would have gone to treatment earlier to use modalities like this, because I wish there would be a treatment center that would be, a healing center where we do use psychedelics in order to help people heal the trauma, because I believe that there will be less relapse. Because I tell people all the time, and I see people in here all the time that have relapsed 15 or 16 times. And I ask them, I said, have you used a modality to help you heal from the trauma? And a lot of times those who are constant retreads, they haven't. Right? They're like, they'll go a year without picking up a drink or a drug, but all of a sudden they'll be triggered and they'll use. Well, you're being triggered because of unhealed trauma. Something is triggering you because of an unhealed part of you, and you want to numb. You want to go into immediate fight or flight. And the ability of us to get somebody to heal their trauma, whether it's microdosing or whatever, they'll be less likely to be triggered to numb themselves with a hardcore drug.
And it's sad because there's still not enough treatment centers that do it, but there's a few that have been, like on the forefront and trying to teach others, but still way too many treatment centers are just warehousing people, like you say, just revolving door, 30 days, they get their payment. They know that they're not curing anybody, and they don't seem to care. And that's why I think it's really sad that, I hope to see, like what you said, someday that treatment centers will incorporate this as a mainstream part, not as some kind of alternative, unusual thing, but it will become something that insurance pays for, that is part of
you think back, insurance used to not pay for EMDR. I mean, insurance used to not cover that because they thought it was kind of like voodoo-ish. They're like, how can this really work? But EMDR does help heal trauma. But again, EMDR, getting people past the frontal lobe to the lower part of the brain in order to unpack a lot of those traumatic memories and reprocess that trauma as an adult. And it's really a lot of inner child work. And I think what we're really talking about is getting people to the point to be vulnerable enough to do the inner child work, to reprocess a lot of that trauma. We're not just saying, hey, go take this pill and and live, because what you're saying, it's assisted with also therapy.
Yes.
It's understanding that it's not just, hey, here's a prescription, go microdose and call it a day. No, it's here's a prescription, but it's in combination with this kind of a therapy in order for you to really reprocess.
Yes, that's really important, because we don't want people to take, MDMA at a EDM concert or
at
whatever.
A concert. No, that's not what this is. And I think that's the stigma we're fighting. Is we say, we talk about these drugs and immediately people go, that's what they do at EDM festivals, and all they're doing is being high as a kite. But that's not what we're talking about here.
It's not, and it's so crucial. The work that is done afterwards is essential to really fortifying and actually not doing the integration work afterward can be really problematic for people. We see all kind of folks emerging from these festivals or retreats with even psychosis and things that they're not able, because it's like doing surgery, leaving the wound open. You just leave that. They're then so vulnerable to all kind of other things. So it is important, as much as I'm excited that these retreats are sort of changing people's attitudes about psychedelics, they're also creating some new problems where people are coming back from the mixing psychedelics sort of haphazardly, and so that's a concern to us. So we're trying to find some middle ground. We want to eliminate the criminalization of these plants and psychedelics, but we want to create enough education where people know how to use these safely, and hopefully we will get through phase 3 trials eventually. FDA will approve this treatment, and then health insurance will cover this. But FDA has been really, blocking us every step of the way. I mean, look, MAPS has been at this for 30 years, and they're only now at the end of phase 3. It's crazy. So you can see that big pharma still has a stronghold on the way FDA thinks. And FDA, half their budget is subsidized by big pharma. So it's a real struggle for the public who wants access to whole plant, whole mushroom. They don't want the constant chemical onslaught, and I'm not against big pharma. I think they make a lot of medicines that are essential, but they need to stop blocking research like this, because we need to have studies, and they're doing everything they can to systematically impede this type of research because they feel so threatened by this. I mean, the problem with this treatment is it actually puts people into remission, right? It could be a potential cure for people. And from big pharma's standpoint, that is a problem, because they don't want to cure people. They want you to be stuck on their pharmaceuticals for years and years and be completely dependent and be riddled with all these side effects. And that's why people are voting with their feet and turning away from chemical pharma stuff and wanting natural alternatives that are safer, less toxic, all that.
Yeah. So as we begin to close this episode, from the studies that you have seen with people, microdosing, what have you seen?
I mean, we've seen some extraordinary stories from folks, but not just them, from their family too, corroborating that they are, much more high functioning. They're more forward thinking. They have hopefulness. If they're if they're attempting to dampen cravings from addiction, that is like the first time that they're reporting they don't have a desire to go use whatever it is, whether it's, whatever, nicotine or sugar or sex or gambling, whatever their addiction is. It seems like microdosing is helping dampen those urges. And that's what we talk a lot about, the neuroplasticity idea. But the fact is, these psychedelics, even in microdosing, are changing people's brains. They're reformulating the way they think. They're changing the connections, and they're therefore then changing behaviors, where you're not seeing these sort of either drug-seeking behaviors or other maladaptive behaviors that they're trying to get rid of. So it's exciting. I mean, we saw the first grant recently, the first large grant looking at psilocybin for treating nicotine addiction I think Matt Johnson at Hopkins got like $4 million
Wow.
to do a comprehensive trial. And this is a great signal for how if it suppresses nicotine addiction, then potentially all these other addictions could get benefit as well, because they're all mediated through those same neurotransmitters in our brain. So I think this will create, the data from this will be really important.
So, Dr. Sisley, where, if people want to read up on more research, where can they go?
Yeah, I would say that's a great question. On psychedelics.
Because you're with the Scottsdale Research Institute.
Yes, so we have, but we don't have as much of a resource library on there as, I think the best place, from my opinion, is to go to maps.org, because they have a lot of great, they've created an online library of all kinds of research on everything from ibogaine to, all kinds of, mostly focused on MDMA. But once you start there, that'll put you into a whole other realm.
A big abyss.
Yeah.
A big abyss of talking about this stuff. Well, Dr. Sisley, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for the research that you're doing. Continue to do it. We need, honestly, we need forward-thinking people like you, because there is a lot. I don't even think we understand the depths of just the trauma of going through a pandemic for 2 years and the amount of trauma that has been.
Yes.
And I think we're going to really start seeing the fallout of that for years and years and years to come. So we need this forward thinking. We need people out there like you experimenting and really being forward and advancing your thinking about how we can use medicine to help people with their trauma. So thank you for coming on. It's so great to have you here, and we'll see you back here for the next episode of Escaping Rock Bottom. Perfect.
Oh, good.
Fantastic. I am so glad that we were able